I want to turn you to a verse in 1 Corinthians, and Pastor Ollie read this, 1 Corinthians chapter 1, 26 and 27, because I think it sort of characterizes, I hope to get to this by the end of my comments with you this morning. Verse 27 says, "But God has chosen the foolish things of the world to put to shame the wise, and God has chosen the weak things of the world to put to shame the things which are mighty. And the base things of the world and the things which are despised God has chosen, and the things which are not, to bring to nothing the things that are." So I was born and raised in Danville, Virginia. Not sure if anybody's ever heard of Danville, Virginia. To my knowledge, Charles Stanley's from Danville, Virginia. So that's about the only person that came out of that town that I know was much to speak of. Danville, I've always thought of it as sort of like Nazareth. You know, what good thing can come out of Nazareth? What good thing can come out of Danville? My father's name was Edgar Hugh Moore, and I have his middle name, and Asa has the middle name Hugh as well. When I was growing up, they called me Huey. Huey was my middle name. So I take great risk in telling you that, you know, because I know Todd is never going to let me forget that my nickname is Huey. Pastor Huey. My mother's name is Dovey Dolores Moore. Before she was married, she was a Hancock. I have one older sister and two younger brothers. And I always get a gasp from the women in the crowd when I tell them that my sister is exactly 10 months and 5 days older than me. Because the women are like, whoa, she didn't get a break, you know. So, yeah, she was born in July, and I was born the following May. I have two younger brothers, Mark, who is 4 years younger than me, and Mark came to visit with us in the summer. I don't know if you remember him. But apparently Mark looks very much like my dad. My uncles, on my mother's side, my grandmother lived next door to us when I was growing up, Granny Hancock, Granny and Papa Hancock. I'll tell you about them a little bit more. But then my uncles were characters. So if you think I cut up, you should have seen my uncles. The worst thing you could do in my house, they would all come over to my granny's house on Sunday after church, and we'd play football and whatever, and they would cut up. And the worst thing you could let my uncles know was that you had a girlfriend. Because you tell my uncles you had a girlfriend, and you're going to get ridden until your dying day. I mean, you know, I won't even say the stuff that they said, the questions they asked me about my girlfriend. Does she have teeth, Huey? You know? So, but, and I have Mark is my younger brother, just under me, 4 years old. And Mark, my uncles would pick on each other because they all were bald. You know, they had the hair around the sides, but they didn't have anything on the top. And I'm losing mine too, but they always called each other Chrome Dome. Did you ever hear that? Did anybody in your family ever call him Chrome Dome? They call him Chrome Dome. And so my brother Mark, I mean, he is just as bald as he can be, but apparently he looked like my dad. So when I was growing up, we were poor. My father, a lot of my history and my testimony goes back to my father, because my father was an alcoholic. My father served in Vietnam. He served 13 months in Vietnam. He was a 50 cal operator, and my mother liked to joke that he went into the military a private and he came out a private, because apparently he couldn't behave himself, you know, the drinking and all the things that he would get into. But when he got out, I guess he's from the mountains in North Carolina, Waynesville, Maggie Valley. Anybody know where Maggie Valley is? It's beautiful there. But they raised some wild boys there, apparently, and my dad was one of them. And so he always had trouble drinking. My dad was, I guess, I don't look like him much facially, but I sort of have his build. My dad was one of those country boys who had strong arms, you know, but he had these skinny little legs, skinny little white legs. I only remember seeing my dad in shorts one time, and he had cut-off jean shorts, boots, and those skinny little legs. And so I don't have the arms that I used to have anymore, but I still got those skinny little legs. My uncles used to joke, they would say, "Boy, aren't you afraid you're going to stand up one day and break those?" So if you've ever seen me at church with shorts on, you know that's about right. Splinters everywhere if I break those legs. But my dad was, I was the oldest son, and so I palled around with him, and he was in and out of jobs all the time. He couldn't seem to keep a job. I think the drinking and not showing up, and I guess he had a temper, and he liked to fight. And so he would lose every good job that he got. But I was the one that would hang around with him. I would pal around with him. And he left when I was 10, but in those years that I remember, he was trying to get disability from the VA for what's probably known now as PTSD. Vietnam was a terrible place. All wars are terrible, but Vietnam was especially bad. So he would go to the VA, and he would spend 30 days there. And I'm going to have to pause a few times, but he would be evaluated for his mental health, and he would come home and he would cry because he missed us. So my dad was not a good dad, but I think he did love us, in his own way. But he lost his license. He was a perpetual DUI guy, DWI back in the day. He'd get drunk and go driving, and so he lost his license for 10 years for habitual DUI. And so he would be home a lot. And my mom would work; she was a waitress, and so we'd pal around, and we'd get old beer bottles, and we'd take the BB gun and we'd shoot them, try and shoot the top out, and that kind of thing. He would cut trees down in the backyard. We had some big oak trees. He would cut those down. I would help him move the lumber and stuff like that. I remember one time I came home with my mom. My dad was out cutting with the chainsaw, and I guess the chainsaw, you know how dangerous a chainsaw is. You're supposed to keep your left arm straight in case it kicks. Well, it kicked, and he didn't have his arm straight, and it cut his finger, and he was bleeding. I remember that just growing up. But he and my mom would fight a lot. I don't remember a lot of physical violence, but I remember a lot of verbal violence. My dad had terrible language, and he would say ugly things to my mother. And when I was 10 years old, I guess they had all they could take of each other, and he decided one night he was going to go visit his mom and dad in Maggie Valley. So I remember him calling a cab. Yeah, I know some of the younger ones in here, a cab, an Uber of the day. Okay. It was an Uber where you had to call on the phone and wait for him to come, and you didn't have an app you could track him. So anyway, I remember my dad used to wear short sleeve shirts that had the butterfly collar, and the material was kind of like a polyester. You remember those back? So this would have been 1982 when he left, and he had a butterfly collar, and it was a blue shirt, and I remember that. I remember the day he left. And I was, of course, the one that was hurt the most by it because I was his oldest son. And my younger brothers were 6 and 5 at the time. My sister, my dad always had he was mean to my sister for some reason. I don't know why. He was always very antagonistic towards her. And even today, my sister, she has, a lot of emotional problems because of my dad. But he left when I was 10, and my mother was a waitress, and it was a good thing that my Granny and Papa lived next door because they kind of took care of us. My mom would go off to work, and we'd go over to Granny's. And so it was a blessing that my grandmother lived there. Now, my Granny Hancock, she was part Cherokee. And so I remember pictures of her, and I remember her. She had straight, long black hair. And there's a picture from when my sister and I were maybe 5 or 6 years old, standing out next to the swing, and my granny never got out of a granny gown, I don't think. Is your granny that way? It's like every time I remember her, she was in a granny gown. And now Dana talks about her granny gown. I'm like, woman, you don't wear granny gowns. You're my wife. My granny wore granny gowns. But she had this long, straight hair, and I remember it coming down, and it was well below her knee, just straight black. So somewhere in my lineage, I have some American Indian in me. But she was a very godly woman, and she would always quote Bible verses to me. And the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want, she would say. And she always encouraged me and my brothers and my sister to love one another. We love one another, love one another. That Jesus would love one another. And of course, we believed that for about 30 seconds, and then we go outside and start fighting again. There's this one great fight we had. Isn't that terrible to say? Looking back on it, it's really funny. My sister Mary, she was a spiteful little cuss. And so she was always trying to get me in trouble. Well, this one time we got into a fight in the summer, and she made me so mad, and I had one of those old Ryder BB guns, and it didn't have any pellets in it or any BBs in it. But I got that thing, and I pumped it, and from about out across the room, I shot at her. And she didn't get hit with anything, but she screamed, and she cried, and she ran over to Granny's, and boy, was I in trouble. Mary, whew. But my granny was the spiritual influence in my life. And I remember one time when I was out, my granny, your granny this way, everybody's granny's probably the same way. She'd call over to the house. Huey, what are you doing? Watching TV, Granny. Well, come over and move this chest of drawers for me. Come over and paint my fence. She always moved stuff, and she always painted stuff. I was like, woman, nobody's lived in this house for 50 years but you and Papa. Why do we have to keep painting everything? But one day I was out raking her leaves, and she came out, and she was always talking to me about the Lord, and she always told me that I was special to the Lord, and the Lord had special work for me. And I remember one day I was out raking the leaves, and my granny called it. I vaguely remember this, but my granny was sitting out on the front porch, and she was watching me rake the leaves, which is what grannies do. And there was a little wind that came up. And it swirled across the lawn, and it picked up those leaves, and it started to move them. And to my granny, that was a sign that God was placing upon me to use me. Now, I don't really remember that, but that's the kind of grandmother that I had. So my mother now, and I'm leading, this has all got to lead up to Christ's work in my life. You have to understand where I'm coming from. My mother was, and my father passed away in 2010, but my mother is still alive. And a few years ago, I had to break off contact with my mother. I had this, because my mother, and I want to be completely honest with you, all right, my mother was manipulative. My mother was mean. My mother used us. My mother was married 4 times, and after my father left and they got divorced, and every time she got married again, she would say, Huey, it's going to be better for you all. It's going to be better for you. But every time, it was really only better for my mother, you know? And she would go away to their house, and she would be gone, and we would stay in that house for weeks at a time by ourselves and going over to Granny's. And it wasn't until I got a little older that I realized what my mother had done to me. It was when I had kids, and I thought, how could you do that to me? I could never do this to them. How could you do this to me? One particular thing that I remember when I went to the military, I went to the Air Force when I was 19. And I met Dana just before that, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that as well. But one of the things that's come to my memory since I've been an adult, so my mom had all these, boyfriends and these husbands, and but when I got in the Air Force and I went through basic training, and I was stationed in San Angelo, Texas, which is far southwest Texas. If you remember those old spaghetti westerns from the Clint Eastwood movies, that's exactly what that was. I mean, very, very hot and very dry, and I was there from April to August, so it was screaming hot. Well, anyway, they have you, when you're in the military, they say you're going to go to the doctor. You got a doctor's appointment, here, go. You got a dentist appointment, here, go. Well, when I went to the dentist, I sat down in the dentist chair, and he started looking at my teeth. And he saw all the plaque on my teeth. And it was so built up. He said, son, if you hadn't come in here now, you would have lost all of your teeth. So my mother never took me to the dentist to get my teeth cleaned. And I thought, it took 5 or 6 trips to get it all out. I mean, it was rough. And I thought, how can you have these relationships and not take care of us? So, after my dad left, and I know I'm risking something in telling you that because I don't mean to dishonor my mother. I'm simply trying to tell you the truth. So you'll understand what Christ has done in my life. When I get to that point, you'll see where I've been and what I've been through. So when my dad left, I was good for a couple of years, and then I got a friend named Richie Evans, and his dad died in the 7th grade when he was 12 years old, and his dad was a drunk and a mean man as well. And so we started palling around. Well, Richie got me into all kinds of stuff, and we started drinking. And then I got a girlfriend when I was about 14. I got this first girlfriend. And, you know, head over heels at that age. We dated for a couple of years. This is another significant event in my life. And then she broke up with me for some other guy that she eventually got married to, and is, to my knowledge, still married to. But it destroyed me. It destroyed me. So no dad. Mom's abusive. Find a girl. You put all of your emotion and all of your value in that girl, and then that girl walks away from you. And so it crushed me. And I went from being an A and B student to, in the 11th grade, I failed 4 out of 6 classes. I've got the old report cards where I missed 30-plus days in my junior and senior year in high school, barely got out of it. And I remember one day I was sitting in, I was so depressed and so lost, and I was sitting in my bedroom, and my mom had called 911 on me because she thought I was going to do something to myself. That's how bad it was. And I was sitting in my bedroom. We didn't have any guns in the house. But I'm sitting in my bedroom, I'm sitting on the edge of the bed with my head in my hands thinking, if I had a gun, I would kill myself right now. I was absolutely certain that I would do that. And so the cops come and the ambulance comes and there's lights everywhere, and that was really one of the low points. But then we started drinking heavily, blackout drunk. I've driven home drunk so many times I couldn't count them all. I mean, so drunk that when I got out of the car, I couldn't get the key in the front door to open the front door. That's how drunk I was. And Richie, he was depressed too, and he was trying to kill himself. He would try and throw himself out of the car while I was driving. And so I'd grab him and hold on to him and try and drive. Terrible depression. Dark, dark depression. And while Richie and I were living together, we got an apartment before we went into the military. And we were living together, and all we were doing was drinking. I mean, every night we would just drink. 6 months, he was going to the Navy, I was going to the Air Force. Well, one of the girls, I don't know, we really weren't dating, we were just kind of friends, and she comes over to the apartment every night, and then she eventually takes me by one of her friends' houses. And I was about half lit at that time, and I walk into this house, and there's this beautiful little blonde named Dana. And I kind of thought she was like a hippie. but there's a story here because I'm such a redneck. You know, she's got nice clothes, her hair is pretty, she's wearing sandals, and I'm thinking she's wearing sandals, she's got to be a hippie. Well, Dana is engaged at that time to a fellow, and Chris was his name. And so they started coming over to our apartment, and we would all drink and party together. And I'm not suggesting that as a way of life. I'm just telling you that's what we did. And eventually Dana and Chris broke up. It had nothing to do with me, so she says. Well, she just couldn't take that charming redneck from Danville. I got to have him. She's so embarrassed right now. I'm going to get it later. So we started dating. Now, so you can see God in my life already. And it's 30 years later. And she's still I'm still her favorite redneck, and she's still my favorite hippie girl. So I went into the Air Force, and Dana and I were dating before then, and we weren't sure what we were going to do. So I got through basic training, and we were still talking, and that was when you had to call each other. You remember the MCI operator, 10 cents? Don't worry, AT&T, we won't get all your customers. You remember that? So anyway, we would talk on the phone, and then I went to tech school, and she came out to visit me, and I broke the rules and left the base. And one of the sergeants that was there, he gave me his car, and we drove around, and we just had a good old time breaking all the rules, just like my dad, I'm sure. And we decided we said, what did we say, Dan? We said we weren't going to get married. And then a couple weeks later, we talked on the phone after she'd left and said we're going to get married. So 6 weeks later, we got married, August 15th, 1992. And I wasn't saved, she wasn't saved, nothing. And so when I went in the Air Force, I became very driven. I didn't want to be poor anymore. I didn't want to be a failure anymore. So I started taking college classes, and they love that in the military. You take college classes, they like that. Your supervisors like that. They will support you in that. So I got 90 credits in 3 years, and the day I left military, I graduated from college. So I was very, very driven. So it's nothing new, Ollie. Where are you? That I'm crazy driven. But I didn't want to be a failure. But along about the second or third year in the military, I started looking for something. I was looking for meaning. And at the time I couldn't tell you that was what I was looking for, but I started to get very philosophical and I think deep and ask deep questions. But I didn't believe in God. I had argued there was no God. Jesus is not. I actually had gone to, when I was 12 years old, I was baptized in a primitive Baptist church. Anybody ever heard of a primitive Baptist church? It's no pianos, a cappella singing, no nursery. They would be considered what you call hyper-Calvinist today. But I actually joined that church and was baptized, but I never believed. Did any of you do that? I never really believed. I just kind of went along. But I was looking for something. I didn't know what it was, so I wasn't going to turn to Jesus. I wasn't going to turn to the Bible. So somebody introduced me to Taoism. And so there's a little book. It's a very little book. It's called The Tao of Pooh. I don't know if you ever remember that. But it's got Pooh on it, Winnie the Pooh on it, and it's called The Tao of Pooh. And it's basically just a book about Taoism. And so I read that book, and I thought, that's interesting, and that's I like that, but that's not it. That's not it. And so I kept looking for something. Then I got out of the military, and I got a job with a greedy businessman named Bob Thompson. And Bob Thompson locked me into all kinds of contracts. Here I am. I wanted to be rich. I said, I'm going to be a millionaire by the day I'm 30. That was me, and I was going to do it. And so I get this job with Bob Thompson. He owned a technology integrator, and Bob makes me sign a non-compete agreement, very aggressive non-compete. And then he makes me sign a contract that says I'll repay any training expenses that he invests in me up to 2 years after I leave, which is fine if you stay. But it was a very bad job. I had a very bad boss, and I was making nothing. I think I was making $19,000 a year. All that school to make $19,000, and I was miserable. But I couldn't get out of it because I had all these contracts. So I feel this great pressure on me. And then I start to look for meaning even more. I'm thinking, am I going to go through this whole life? Is this what this whole life is going to be? I'm just going to struggle and fight these greedy businessmen and try to make some money. Then I'm going to turn 65 and I'm going to die? I'm going to get old, retire, and get sick and die? Is that it? That was the thinking. So in this stressful situation, I was trying to leave that job, and I was so stressed out that the lawsuit I left the job, actually. I took another job, and the lawsuit was coming. He was suing me, and at 23, 24 years old, that was overwhelming to me, to be sued in court. And so I was really looking for things then. I would hear songs, and I would think spiritual things. I would see the trees, and I would see the clouds, and I would think, there's got to be something more here to this. I was being awakened in a big way. And so I went down to visit an uncle of mine who was a deacon in this church that I had joined and was baptized in years before. Good Home Primitive Baptist Church in Axton, Virginia. Yeah, Axton, Virginia. Find it. I don't think Google has it. Google will be like, hold on a minute, searching, calculating. So I went to see my uncle because I liked my uncle at the time. We had a good relationship, and he was a deacon there. So I just went to church with him. And I'm sitting in the back like I did when I was a kid, and I'm not paying any attention to the preacher. No attention to the preacher at all. And I'm under such tremendous stress. Dana's pregnant with Maddie, our first child. We want her to be able to quit work. And so I have all this pressure on my mind. And I'm sitting there in the back of this church. And here's Mr. Atheist. Mr. Jesus is not the really God. He's just a good guy. Mr. Better than all that religion stuff. And I'm sitting there. And I'm so stressed out, I spot a Bible in the back of the pew. And I think to myself, I wonder if there's anything in there about stress. So I pulled the Bible out, and I opened it up to the back, and I looked up. I don't think the word stress was in there, but anxious or anxiety was in there somewhere. And when I opened it I don't remember what verse it was, but when I opened the book, it was like in the movies, when the light shines in your face and everything around you gets quiet and it's as if you just disappeared into somewhere else. And I started reading the book, and it grabbed me like getting hit by a train. It pulled me in, and I started reading, and I was like, whatever I'm looking for, I just found it. And I kept reading. I didn't listen to anybody talk. I kept reading. And when I got to my uncle's house that day, I said, do you have a Bible that I could have? Because I've got to read the book. And so he says, sure. And he gives me a King James Bible, and I take it home. And I read, and I read, and I read. And then I get to the words in red. Do you all know what the words in red are? In many old Bibles, the words of Christ are in red. And I didn't find it right away. It took me a little while to get there. And I remember the Bible talks about God, the God of the Bible, as being a living God. He is alive. And when I read the words in red, I met someone. I mean, he was as real as anyone I couldn't believe the things that he said. I was dumbfounded at how wise he was, at how courageous he was. I could not understand this 30-year-old man saying these things. I was floored by Jesus the Christ. And that was 25 years ago. And he has absolutely, it's still the same. Nothing has changed. He got a hold of me so powerfully. It was like a Paul-like experience. And my life turned on a dime so fast that my family and my friends and Dana's family, they didn't understand it. They all were like, who is this guy? We don't know you. And I said, I don't know what to tell you. I found what I was looking for. He has transformed my life. And I think it's significant for me as I look upon my ministry. I think it's significant for me that I was not converted by a preacher. I was not converted by an evangelist. And those are all God's instruments. Don't misunderstand me. I was converted in a church with a preacher by this. This converted me. This changed me. And I cannot get enough of it. After that, I started attending a church at at a Primitive Baptist church in Roanoke, Virginia. And there was a wonderful pastor there named Thomas Mann. And I write about Thomas. I put Thomas in my books and stuff like that because he was such a godly man to me. And even though the Primitive Baptists were kind of way out there doctrinally, Thomas wasn't. And Thomas, little skinny guy, skinnier than me. Dana used to joke and say if you guys got into a fight, it'd be sparks flying everywhere because you're like two little skinny metal rails clanging against one another. But Thomas was such a good witness to us, wasn't he, Dana? He was such a wonderful man. I was there for 5 years. And he taught me to pray. So if I come along to you and I say, let's stop and pray for a minute. Thomas Mann taught me that. Stop and pray. We did it yesterday. Hold on, let's pray. That's what Thomas taught me. We'd go for drives and we'd be like, every hour on the hour, let's pray together. Thomas taught me to pray. Thomas taught me to look into the words of the Bible and see what they actually meant and not just hear what the preacher said. But it's been very hard since then. The Lord called me out to ministry, and to some very abusive churches and some very difficult churches. And as I've talked to you about before, I'm just coming out of a 13-year-long trial where God has put me through, Jesus, the Christ, has put me through some of the most difficult things I've ever experienced. But why do I bring you to this verse here? God has chosen the foolish things of the world to put to shame the weak, the wise. And God has chosen the weak things of the world to put to shame the things that are mighty. And the base things of the world and things which are despised God has chosen. And the things which are not to bring to nothing the things that are. Let me speak to you as Paul did as I wrap this up. As a man. And I'm going to tell you this so I can make a point. And God be the glory. I'm the first one in my family that ever graduated from college. Either side. I'm the first one ever to get a master's degree. I have 2 bachelor's degrees and 2 master's degrees. I've written 8 books. I've pastored in God's churches. I've witnessed and evangelized. I am not the father my father was to me. I am a good father. I love my children. I am with my children. And you know the greatest compliment that I could ever get is one that I hope I will get when I'm gone. And I hope that my children, when they're sitting down and I'm gone, and they're sitting with their children or their grandchildren, or maybe they're sitting at work and somebody talks about fathers, and somebody talks about maybe how bad their father was, and that my children will say, my dad was the greatest dad ever. My dad was always with me. My dad always challenged me to excellence. My dad prayed with me. My dad taught me. My dad explained things to me. My dad told me the hard things that I needed to be told. I'm not the dad my dad was. And I'm not the husband that my father was. I have been with the same woman for 30 years. Why do I say that? Because look what Christ can do with a life. I am a nobody who came from a no town with no name. And look what He's taken me from. Look at what He's done in my life. And I know that He is not finished yet because He does choose the foolish things of the world. He chooses the weak things of the world. He chooses the things which are not to do things that can never be forgotten. And all of you, and I don't mean this as a criticism, you're just like me. You don't have a name. You don't have wealth. You don't have status. You're not from any great town. But Christ can take your life. And He is. I know He is. And He can make it into something powerful. Do you believe that? Hasn't He done it for you? And let me tell you something. He is not done with us. What are we here today? Maybe 40 people. 40 people fed 72 families yesterday. 40 people went boldly in the name of Christ and had people sitting down here and crying for the love of Christ that was shown to them. You see? He used the foolish things of the world to put to shame the wise, and the weak things of the world to put to shame the things which are mighty. And my friends, He is not done with us yet. And He's not done with you yet. You can be transformed even more than you think you can now by this man who's in this book. It's the greatest book ever. Read it, follow it, and He will transform you as He has me. Let's pray together.